this is an exclusive show when we go about giving us a reminder of the dastardly 1985 terror attack. It was an Air India 182 Kanishka bombing that led to the death of 329 people. Most of them were Indians who were located in Canada. On this very special telecast, I get to you the family members of the victims who lost their lives on that fateful day. Joining me on the telecast, first off, is Mr. Rob Alexander, who lost his father in the tragic Kanishka bombing of 1985. Rob, my first question to you, thank you so much for joining us on NewsX. And what was the reason that your family, your father was visiting India?
At the time, he was going to go see his mother, who was not doing well health-wise, so he thought it would be wise to go see her in case something were to happen while we were still in Canada. So he made that trip at that time for that reason.
And how and when did you hear about the terror attack? Obviously, first off, it was not being determined that it was a terror attack. Obviously, there was much speculation about it. There was probes that happened. But when did you come to know about this incident?
Well, we, my mom, my brother, sister, and I were still back home in Hamilton, Ontario. We got a phone call that morning. I believe it was around 6:30 in the morning. And there was another party from the Indian community who was asking my mom, because again, at that time, Air India only had one flight going per week. So everyone in the community knew who was going when, because there was only one flight. So that gentleman was calling my mom to see if a mutual friend of theirs, was going to India and was on that Air India flight, not knowing that my father was booked to travel. And so that person called around 6:30 in the morning, and my mom picked up the phone, and he asked if that party was on the plane, and she didn't know. She said she didn't know, and she said why, and she said the gentleman said that the plane, there was in the news that the plane had gone down, that we didn't know it was a bombing or a terror attack at the time. We didn't know for many days even if there was any survivors. The government was not very good at communicating that fact, and they probably didn't know it themselves, truthfully, but we were kind of in the dark for a long time.
And how did you feel back in the time you lost your father? That's the information that you got over the phone call. How did you cope? How did you and your family cope with this sudden loss? Obviously, your mother was left to fend for herself, and all of you and two of your younger siblings.
Well, again, we didn't know. It was probably a few days that we were told that there was no survivors. It was just really shock and disbelief, because we didn't know about any bomb threats. We didn't know any of the leading up to the problem, the bombing. We didn't know about the bomb threats that Air India knew about. We didn't know that the RCMP here in Canada had been warned that they were targeting something for Air India. So we were just shocked that this was even happening to us and in Canada. And my father being at the wrong place at the wrong time, he was unfortunately on that flight right in the middle of that. So we were just numb and shocked. I don't know what else to say on that. Just couldn't believe it.
Now, Rob, do you think the Canadian government has done enough for the families of the victims of the terror attack?
Not even close, I would say, in my opinion. They haven't acknowledged much about the bombing. There was an inquiry, and there was lots of recommendations as a result of that inquiry, but we feel that it's gone on deaf ears because the government of today doesn't pay any attention to it. And that's very clear and very evident in terms of how they prioritize things. But right now, like the inquiry had lots of good things to say that would protect Canadians and address some of the concerns that the Air India bombing brought up, in particular how families were treated, liability, in terms of who knew, and the fact that the government knew and they had the duty to warn Canadians, and they didn't do anything close to that. There's lots of information in the inquiry documents that the government was even RCMP and CSIS were watching the people in question and didn't do anything. So, in terms of done enough, they've got a long way to go, and it's been 38 years, and a lot of people have passed on and won't see justice. If justice is another thing that is even attainable, we don't even know.
And were you and your family satisfied with the court verdict back in the day and the legal proceedings that were brought forth in the case?
Unfortunately not. I'm realistic in the fact that it was the first time Canada in general was trying a terrorist trial. And it turns out, I remember going to the trials in Vancouver and then hearing the verdict many months later that they didn't have the burden of proof to convict these two guys. But it was very clear from the evidence that these were the guys that perpetrated the crimes. But being a one-judge panel and not having the burden of proof, they didn't convict them. So it would be nice for them to reopen the trial if there's proper evidence, but it was a big waste of time and money at the time, but they had to try, I guess. But in terms of being satisfied with the verdict, of course not.
Now, if you take a look back at the trial, there was only one person by the name of Recount who was found guilty, and it was not over a terror charge against him. He was charged of manslaughter. Why do you think the Canadian authorities were not able to nail down the perpetrators of the terror attack?
That's a good question. I think it has to do with a lot of what I just said in terms of not investigating it properly. There was people who knew about what led up to the bombing were not willing to testify. They didn't urge them enough to testify with information that they knew. People were probably afraid as well. They didn't want to testify against known terrorists in the country, and knowing what they knew and what happened to Air India, why would people want to put themselves in jeopardy? There's that fear. I'm not sure why they couldn't do it. It seemed like they did a good job, and they see leading up to the end of the trial, but obviously that wasn't the case according to the judge's opinion.
Now, one of the many accused in the terror attack, Ajay Singh Bagri, continues to roam free in Surrey. What would you want the government of Canada and the police forces in Canada to do? Would you want the case to be reopened?
Well, again, that's to do with the trial. And if there was sufficient evidence to go back and retry, in Canada, there's that double jeopardy law applies, and you can't retry for the same thing unless there's new evidence that has come up, is my understanding. And it's been a long time. It's been more than a lifetime, unfortunately, to put up with this, and the lack of attention from the government and the legal system. It would be good for the government and the legal system to acknowledge what's happened and convict these people who have perpetrated the crimes, whoever it is, whether it's that guy or someone else. Someone obviously put this plan into place from the Canadian side, but the families have not been done right by in both instances, from the Canadian government and the legal side.
Now, Rob, do you also think that the Canadian government has given safe haven to Khalistani extremists and terrorists in Canada?
I think by tolerating banned terrorist organizations in Canada, they tolerate and indirectly give safe haven. I do think that they don't. In some of the parades that they have in BC, they have known people who have associated with these groups, and they venerate and they celebrate them, and the authorities do nothing to stop that. So that kind of spits in the memory of the face of the memory of our lost loved ones. So that's not very good, and it's not respectful. It's not doesn't give a good environment to families who've lost loved ones as a direct result of these groups spreading hate and their own, political and religious agenda. That's not very fair to the families and the lost loved ones.
Thank you, Rob Alexander, for joining us on this very special telecast, telling us your story of grief and sorrow and the horror when you lost your father, and a difficult time that you and your family has had to face in the last 38 years. Meanwhile, I also have with me another guest who lost his entire family, his wife, his two little children in the 1985 attack. I have with me Dr. Sankurathari Chandrasekhar. He was so devastated, he lost the purpose of his life. He ended up returning to India soon after the attack that took place. He opened up a charity trust in Andhra Pradesh, the village where her wife belonged to, and since then has been continuing with charity work when it comes to the health and education of rural places in Andhra Pradesh. It's good to have you, Dr. Chandrasekhar, with us on the telecast. Again, if you could just rewind and tell us what was the reason that your children and your wife were traveling to India?
They were coming for my brother-in-law's wedding, supposed to be in August 4th, and they started on June 23rd from Canada. I was supposed to come later, and we all planned to go back together before the school start in Canada.
And what were you doing? Where were you? How did you and when did you hear about the 1985 terror attack? Obviously, it was first a crash that was reported. What were you doing? How did you react after that?
Next day, I dropped them at Montreal Airport on 22nd night. 23rd morning, by 5:30, somebody knocked on my door. When I opened the door, there were a lot of people waiting outside the door. I didn't know why so many people were there in the morning, Sunday morning. So they slowly came into the house and told me that plane is disappeared from radar. That was the first time I had something happen to the flight.
Sir, do you think the Canadian government has done enough for the families of the victims of the attack?
I don't know. I don't think anybody knows it's going to happen. Probably if they know, they would have prevented it. Nobody knows how it happened, why it happened, but it happened.
Dr. Chandrasekhar, were you satisfied with the legal proceedings in the case that transpired afterwards?
I really, to be honest with you, I never followed the legal issues, neither the court case nor anything afterwards, because I left Canada in 1988 with a mission to do something more meaningful with my life. So since that time, I didn't really bother to find out what was happening or what happened, except hearing little bit news here and there. Other than that, I could not follow too much. nor did I interested to follow also, because I have a mission in front of me. I'm focusing everything on that, how to do it, what to do, where could I get the resources and all those things. So I did not pay any attention to the legal aspects of the case.
Now, talking about the convicts, there was only one person, Recount, who was found guilty. And he was not just found guilty and charged with a terror attack, he was charged for manslaughter. Why do you think that the Canadian authorities, the legal system, were not able to nail down the perpetrators of the attack?
I really have no idea. I really don't know what happened. I don't know who is that guy also. I don't know the name also. So without knowing all those things, I really can't assess why they're not able to do this or that. Because politics is something I don't understand, nor do I try to understand also, because it's beyond my comprehension. I'm a basic scientist, deal with the facts, and I'm dealing with facts. I deal with human beings. I deal with the human beings suffering. I also try to help them in whatever way I can. So this is my life has been here for the last 35 years. And other than this, I have no knowledge about anything else.
There were three persons who were accused. There were three persons against whom there was a trial. Recount obviously served his term and was then, he was let out of jail. There was another perpetrator. He was actually let go of because there was no proof of burden. There was no burden of proof. Now there was one individual by the name of Ajay Singh Bagri. Now he continues to live in Canada and spread the pro-Khalistani agenda. Ratu in Surrey in British Columbia. Would you want to get this case reopened to ensure that the culprits this time around are convicted?
I don't think so, because to me, nothing will come out of it. My family won't come back. So my life won't be changed. I already, 37 years after the tragic accident, it really doesn't bother me at all what they do, what they don't do. My life has taken a different path, and I am strict to it, and I want to pursue that. And I am also already 8 years old. I really have no interest in following the case or doing anything at all.
I sympathize with you, sir, but also do you think the Canadian government has been giving safe havens to Khalistani extremists and terrorists in Canada amidst all the big developments that are taking place recently?
I'm sorry, that also I don't know. But I lived in Canada for 22 years. Canada was a nice country for me to live. It molded my character, molded my thinking, molded my behavior, everything. I have a lot of Canadian support across the country from East Coast to West Coast. I have very fond memories of Canada, and I have everything good but nothing bad to say about Canada. So with this scenario, I also wanted to thank all the Canadians who has helped me to achieve the humanity services what I am doing here. For this, I am always thankful to Canadians. Towards this gesture, I am also proposing to build a small Canada-India Peace Gardens as a tribute to their support for me in the compound here in Kakinada.
Obviously, you're here in Andhra Pradesh now. You let go of all your ties. Your work was in Canada and you've moved. It's been over 35 years in India, in Andhra Pradesh. But do you think you would you'd expect the Canadian government to do something to give closure to you as a family member who's lost your family, your entire family to the attack? Would this allow for some closure that the families of the victims at this point of time are seeking?
I don't think they can do anything what they have done, in my opinion, because justice is something different. Whatever we got was, nobody can repair the damage. So either government or people have been very supportive to me. So I really can't say about government. I only care for people with whom I worked, with whom I still have contacts in Canada.
Well, I appreciate you, Dr. Chandrasekhar, for joining us on this telecast, telling us that dastardly attack and the story behind how you lost your family members. A difficult time for you. Obviously, the wounds cannot be healed even after so many decades have passed. I have with me one more person who lost his entire family, his father, his little sister, his stepmother. Let me introduce to you Sanjay Lazar. He joins me to tell me more about what happened on that fateful day. Sanjay, thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming to the channel. And what I want to know about you, for how and when did you hear about the 1985 attack? And when did you get the news that your all three members of your family had perished in the attack?
I heard about the attack on the same day itself, and I had, my sister's godparents who came over and then took me to their place and told me about it. I was a kid then, and I flew out to London that very day to go to find out about it and identify the bodies. Yeah.
Sanjay, obviously a very difficult time for you. You yourself said you're a very little kid trying to decipher what's happened. You've lost your entire family. You must have been weeping for days, weeks together. How did you react to all that? How long did it take for you to come to terms with the tragic loss?
My father was the in-flight supervisor operating the flight. My mother and sister were on a holiday. I was supposed to join them. I didn't go with them. Of course, I felt terrible and devastated. It was just mind-numbing and shocking. And, I really had no words. Yeah. I spent the next month there, waiting and looking for the bodies.
Yes, since then, you've also penned a book, a memoir, homage to your parents who lost their lives in the attack. Meanwhile, you've also spoken about the Canadian government and what is it that the victims have been expecting of it. And has the Canadian government fallen short of the expectations of the families who've lost their family members in this tragic terror attack? Do you think the Canadian government has done enough to give closure to the families?
Actually, no government has done enough. Neither the Canadian nor the Indian, only the Irish have done enough. And there are people who have forgotten that it existed. There are people who have manipulated the entire narrative in Canada. And it's very, very sad and tragic that 331 people gave up their lives on that day in Tokyo and in Ireland, and people still haven't learned lessons from that.
I know you were a little child. I don't know if you've been tracking this entire case, the proceedings, the trial, but finally when you got the sense of what was really happening, when you grew up and you look back at the trial, do you think it was a satisfactory court verdict and were the legal proceedings up to mark in the case?
No, ma'am. I went in 2005 for the core criminal hearing. I was very dissatisfied. I felt robbed. I felt cheated. And I felt like my family had died again. And we lobbied and kept writing letters to various government officials, both in India and in Canada. And then finally, Canada relented. And then we had the Justice John Major inquiry, which then took another couple of years. But that was not criminal. So really the criminals got away here.
Talking about the conviction that did not happen really, the terrorists were let go, they were scot-free. There were 3 of these people who were tried on the cases. There were charges against him, only 1 got the punishment, only 1 was put behind bars. He was convicted in the case, and that too for manslaughter, not for a terrorist attack. Why do you think that happened? Was there enough evidence for the Canadian authorities to then pin down these terrorists, these extremists, the ones who were perpetrators of the attack?
If you go through the records, you will find the initial trial, of course, Parmar got away, but, Bagri and Malik, a lot of the witnesses either died mysteriously or killed or refused to remember or just didn't. And I think the court did not place too much reliance or did not trust the witnesses who came forward, who gave detailed testimony implicating Malik and Bagri. And unfortunately, that was the Canadian way. And what Rayat got charged was what not, he got charged with a much lesser charge of being the bomb maker and then of manslaughter. And so completely different, conspiracy to blow up an aircraft and kill 331 people is quite different from a manslaughter charge. And 2 people got away scot-free. 3 actually. Parmar 2. So.
Yeah. Yes. You're talking about Bagri and talk about Malik. Obviously, we're talking about Bagri, Ajab Singh Bagri. He's the lone surviving person who was, there was a trial against him. He was not convicted. He continues to be in Canada. He's in Surrey currently and continues to spread the pro-Khalistani agenda. Would you want the case to be reopened and action be taken against Bagri?
Reopening the case is a criminal trial, and the criminal trial has actually been concluded. And of course, I'd like it, to be looked at again. Yes, of course. But is that legally possible? As a lawyer, I don't believe that you can try the same man again for the same crime. But they should have been behind bars for the rest of their life. All 3 of them. 2 of them got bullets, and recently, we've heard of the 3rd. So yeah, of course, we'd like to have all of them, pay the penalty. Yeah.
Another question, Sanjay, do you think the Canadian government has been giving safe havens to the Khalistani extremists and terrorists in Canada, and the stance that has been taken by India is well deserved in terms of action that needs to be taken? And is there a way that India can force Canada to do so by degrading our diplomatic terms and trade terms with them?
I lost my entire family, my father, my stepmother, my sister. I was 17 then. And I fought over the last 38 years, to let their voice be heard. Canada has become a soft target. It's become a safe haven for radicals of all the world. And if you go back into history, you'll find even Sri Lankan separatists were there and other countries' separatists. They've all sought refuge, even Chinese, in Canada. And that's exactly what's happening with these Khalistani radicals. I've covered all this in my book, which is on Angel's Wings, which releases in a month from now. And it's a trilogy which will cover the entire history of this bombing and the problem and how Canada dealt with it and how they didn't deal with it. So yes, of course, Canada has become, a state that harbors people who want to secede or bring terrorism upon other countries.
What is the message, Sanjay, that you would like to give to the Canadian government? What appeal do you make to the Canadian government? Do you think Canada should do something and sooner than later to give closure to the families of the victims?
closure can only come with justice. So the first thing is justice. They need to give justice. If they cannot give justice, which in this case, I do not think that they'll ever be able to give us justice. We're not seeking vengeance. It is a clear and present admission of facts, and the story has never really come out. And secondly, I think Canada still needs to, revise laws related to terrorism, anti-terrorism, secessionism. Freedom of speech is fine, but where do you draw the line? You draw the line at saying, let's kill the Indian diplomats, or do you draw the line at saying, let's bomb an Air India aircraft, or let's kill a prime minister? There has to be a line in civil society, and I think Canada needs to understand that, or they're going to become, like any of the basket case civilizations we've seen in the last 100 years across mankind.
Thank you, Sanjay, for joining us on the telecast, sharing your story. In fact, I have with me one more person who lives in Canada. He lost his two sisters, and he was barely a teenager when that tragic incident happened. Deepak Khandelwal is on the telecast with me. He spoke to my colleague Vineet Malhotra. Let's quickly listen into his story as well.
We're going to speak with Mr. Deepak Khandelwal. Deepak was in fact only 17 when he lost his sisters Chandra and Manju in this tragedy. He's speaking to us from Toronto. Deepak, thank you for speaking with us. What do you remember of that day? Let's start with that.
Well, back in 1985, as you said, I was 17. My sisters and I were supposed to go to my uncle's wedding in India. So that was the trip. I was supposed to go with them, but due to a last-minute scholarship I received to go to the University of Calgary, I canceled my ticket just beforehand. So that day was me and my father taking my sisters to the airport. We were living in Western Canada at the time, a place called Saskatoon. We took them to the airport, we dropped them off, and thinking everything was all fine. I then boarded a bus, an overnight bus, to go to the University of Calgary. And then unfortunately, when I arrived in Calgary, I was informed that, well, the way they positioned it was my father was not feeling well, so I needed to return home. So I jumped on a plane to come back to Saskatoon, and when I landed in Saskatoon, obviously I heard what the reality was that the plane was missing and had disappeared off the coast of Ireland. So a pretty shocking day, and probably the most difficult part of it is we were all in different locations. I was on a bus on the way to Calgary. My father was in Saskatoon. My mother had already arrived in India for the wedding. So we were all separated.
Right. Deepak, what ensued thereafter? Obviously, apart from the great bereavement that you and your family suffered, there must have also prevailed a sense of exacting justice at that point in time.
Well, I mean, at that time I was 17 and we were a little bit isolated being in Western Canada, and there was no internet back then, so communications was quite limited. So you didn't really know what was going on, but you could tell early on that things were not right. I actually went to Ireland with my father to go identify the bodies, and there was no Canadian officials there to support us. There was no victim counseling. There was no emotional support, nothing at all. And as there was over 280 Canadians that were on this flight. The Canadian government really didn't take this seriously. Just to give you an example of how unseriously they took this, you have the largest mass murder in Canadian history, the worst act of aviation terrorism other than 9/11. And it took 20 years for a Canadian Prime Minister to even meet with the families. So, I mean, this whole process has been very poorly handled from day one. I would say things have gotten a little bit better in family communications recently, but the early years were very, very poor, and it seemed like nobody up here really cared about what had happened.
Deepak, you also feel that initially there was intelligence failure to figure out whether something like this could happen in plain sight, and there were a lot of incidents, right before this crash, which were completely and blatantly ignored, by the authorities. at the security services in Canada. And post the crash, picking up the clues, trying to be serious about people who knew something or the other about this crash or the perpetrators, there was not much gravitas to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, this was a completely preventable tragedy, in my opinion. There were significant failures on the investigation side ahead of time as the intelligence services. And as you said, there were direct warnings that there was going to be a bomb placed on an Air India flight. There was only one flight a week at that time, so it's not hard to figure out which flight that might be. So, as Dr. Gupta mentioned as well, there were surveillance failures of when they were following people and stopped following people. They didn't take pictures. They knew there was an explosion that was testing bomb material. So significant failures prior to the bombing. There were procedural failings on the day of the bombing. The investigation itself had significant failures post-bombing, just in whether it's the wiretaps that were erased, which makes absolutely no sense at all. In the public inquiry, I talked about that, as well as Justice Major mentioned that it's just inconceivable that people would erase wiretaps in such a critical case. And then as went into the legal case, there was, lots of evidence was not accepted. Lots of witnesses were either no longer around, and so were unable to speak, or the judge deemed them to be unacceptable witnesses. So there was just mistakes all around in this entire process, from pre-bombing, day of bombing, post-bombing, the legal case, and it's just been very, very disappointing for the families.
Deepak, last question before we let you go. Do you think that the families will ever see the light of justice prevail as long as Canada continues, with its policy of, putting freedom of speech before justice?
Yeah, I think it's very unfortunate. We have a situation where known extremists and terrorists are celebrated at events. Pictures are shown. Canadian politicians go to those events, or need or want to get the political votes, and it's very disheartening to see that. It's very hurtful when terrorists are glorified and celebrated in this country. And I think we need to be very, very careful in this country that something like what happened to us, where 329 innocent people were murdered by terrorists, something like that does not happen again, because no one should have to go through this again. It's a real shame.
Deepak, appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much for speaking with NewsX. Welcome back. You're watching NewsX. My name is Vineet Malhotra. On the telecast with me are two Indian Canadians who unfortunately lost their family members in the tragic 1985 Air India bombing. First up, we're going to speak with Mr. Bal Gupta, who's the chair of Air India Victims Families Association. He's joining us from Canada. Mr. Gupta lost his wife, Ramvati, when she was murdered along with 328 other innocent people by terrorists on board Air India Flight 182 as it crashed into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Ireland on the 23rd of June 1985. Mr. Gupta, appreciate you speaking with us. Thank you so much for taking out the time and talking to NewsX. I hope you can hear me, sir.
Thank you.
So, what are your memories of that fateful day? Can you take us through what you heard and when you heard, and what happened after that?
Well, we were planning to go, the whole family, me, my wife, and 2 boys, to visit our family after 4 years. And she was going alone on that flight, and we were supposed to join her 2 weeks later on a subsequent flight. Now, I left them on 22nd at the airport, came home, and early morning I was awakened by a phone call from a friend. And he said, "Did your wife go yesterday, last night?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Turn the radio on and listen to the news. Something has happened." As I turned the radio, the news was that Air India Flight 182 has disappeared off the radar, and they expect no survivors. So early at about 5:30 or 5:45 Canadian time, I came to know that the tragedy had happened.
So what were the first thoughts that came to your mind when you heard this? Obviously, it was later discovered that it was no technical failure, but a terrorist attack.
Well, at that time, the first thought was maybe it's the wrong information and maybe it's some other flight. But when it was confirmed, then as a layman, I didn't know what to say or what to know. I just prayed that she may be alive. But this terrorist attack and all that came later on.
So it's been almost 4 decades since this terrible tragedy took place. But for people like yourself, who've been looking for closure, who've been looking for, the people who are accountable for this tragedy, there is still no respite.
Well, that is true. Families feel that the justice has not been carried out to full extent. Only one person was imprisoned, Mr. Rayat, and he's out now after completing his sentence according to the Canadian laws, and nobody else has been held accountable. So we still feel that the justice has not been done.
So you continue to live in Canada, and Canada has had security issues when it comes to taking care of witnesses, taking care of people who are ready to testify against those who were responsible. Do you think that the investigation there and after this terrible crash was not done as professionally as would the families of the victims would want them to?
I think it would be fair to say that at that time, Canadian administration was not really used to this type of attacks or this type of incidents. I think they learned on the way. I'm not defending them. There were definitely mistakes made in the investigation. They were keeping these couple of guys under surveillance for a long time. And just before the incident, the surveillance was taken off. Then, during the investigation process, certain very important files were erased. There was lack of communication or competition, whatever you call it, between CSIS, which is the intelligence branch of Canadian government, and RCMP, which is the investigative branch, looking at the time in this case. And that was the biggest mistake in my mind in the investigation.
So do you find it strange that the biggest terrorist attack on Canadian soil continues to be unsolved for so long?
Well, that's the law of the land. We may like it or we may not like it. The main thing is that two other guys were brought to court as accused. They were not innocent. They were not declared innocent. That is not done under the law, but they were let go for lack of sufficient evidence. The investigative branch and the prosecutive branch of government could not prove the case without doubt. But as families, definitely we feel cheated.
So the people who are responsible for this, their associates, the lineage that belongs to these terrorists still continues to live in Canada. They still continue to be protected by the current Liberal government and their Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. What do you have to say to that?
Well, the law is the same. You can't take somebody's crime on the children, and whosoever is proved not guilty is not guilty in law. The worst thing is that we fear, particularly under the current circumstances, that something like this may not happen again. And as families of the victims, we pray and hope that nothing like that will happen again.
So you're in touch with the other families as well who've lost loved ones in this terrible crash. What do you make of their sentiment towards this unsolved mystery?
Well, as I said, the government of the day and the whole setup was not functioned properly at that time, at least. And that, number one, led to this incident. Also, there were some warnings earlier which were ignored. And the families know it. I and most of us I and other families keep in touch even today. Most of them, not all of them, mind it, in 38 years, many people who lost the family members have gone. But still, people say that wounds heal with time, but that is not the case. Those who have lived with the tragedy, their wounds will go with them. Those wounds will be never healed. Maybe a scar has formed, but when anything happened, then those wounds get green.
So, last question before we let you go. The families of the victims, are they still hopeful that those who are responsible will be brought to books and the Canadian government will perhaps, follow the paper trail, follow the clues and deliver justice one day?
Well, officially, whenever we meet RCMP or communicate with them, they say investigation is still not closed. Now, under the law, the murder files are never closed. But I think it would be foolhardy to think that after 38 years, anybody else will be brought to court to face the law. But some people may keep on hoping against the hope that some miracle might happen. But it is, I think, almost impossible to get that done.
Mr. Balgupta, appreciate you joining us, sir. Thank you so much.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.